Everyone makes bad decisions once in a while. You may have spent $300 to buy an N-Gage, or invested in a Super Scope for the SNES. So we're all guilty of dropping a clanger once in a while. However, when you and I do it, we just end up owning a terrible piece of gaming paraphernalia. But when a multinational gaming company does it, it can be a mistake to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. So, in this episode, we take a look at these ill-advised arrangements, these junky judgments, and these dodgy decisions, as I say. But hello you, I'm Guru Larry, and I welcome you to Fact Hunt. 5 disastrous gaming decisions you probably didn't know about. Sega turning down Sony? Yeah, well, if you were expecting me to talk about Nintendo stabbing Sony in the back over the whole Super Famicom CD console, well, I'm afraid that's just too obvious for a Fact Hunt episode. Every one of you watching already knows that Sony produced a console for Nintendo, but then Nintendo got cold feet and pulled out. So Sony then went into the console business by themselves and created a PlayStation. However, this is not exactly what happened. You see, after being blown out by Nintendo, Sony didn't straight away go off on their lonesome. Actually, they went to Nintendo's main rival at the time, Sega. Sony and Sega struck up a business relationship and jointly funded 3 titles to be created by a small studio called Digital Pictures. If you own a Sega Mega CD, you'll remember Digital Pictures for the frankly awful FMV games like Night Trap, Make My Video and Sewer Shark that were all the rage in the early 90s. With this business relationship in place, the man known as the father of PlayStation, Crazy Ken Kutaragi, spoke to then president of Sega America, Tom Kalinske, about creating a co-produced piece of hardware, where they would split the loss on the hardware and make their money back on games. So, Sony engineers met up with some Sega of America guys and drew up specs for what this new machine should be. Ken was happy, Tom was happy. So, they took their idea to the big boss of Sega Japan, Hayao Nakayama, and he said definitely not. He was not happy about working with Sony one bit. Nakayama said Sony lacked any sort of knowledge about gaming hardware and just tore the whole idea to pieces. It was at this point that Sony decided they would go off on their own and create the PlayStation. In hindsight, Sega really dropped the ball here. Had they agreed to the deal, the PlayStation would never have been created, thus removing their biggest competitor, and considering the 3DO and Jaguar were complete non-starters, Sega would have had the entire market to themselves for around 2 years, thanks to Nintendo's constant delays for the Nintendo 64. But, alas, this is just another Sega blunder of the mid-90s, which you can file next to the 32X and actually releasing Sonic R. For the first year of the PlayStation 2's life, it's fair to say that the quality software was a bit thin on the ground. Although Ridge Racer 5 and SSX were good games, they were gems in a dribble of urination that consisted of the unwanted cue ball billiards master and the rather sad-looking Wild Wild Racing. It wasn't until a year later that Sony had a world-conquering exclusive in the form of Grand Theft Auto 3, with follow-ups Vice City and San Andreas also delighting players of the world's best-selling console, with San Andreas becoming the biggest-selling title in the PS2's library. However, things could have been so different had Microsoft not made a hilariously bad gaffe while they were in the process of bringing their X-shaped behemoth to market. Rockstar Games made a pitch to Microsoft about how they plan to bring their Grand Theft Auto series to full 3D, and asked Microsoft if they'd like to fund it in return for an exclusivity deal. Microsoft listened to their pitch, but turned the deal down, saying that they didn't think the previous games had been successful enough, and that Rockstar's open world design sounded too confusing. Sony, on the other hand, could smell a winner and agreed to make a payment for a timed exclusive. And the rest is history. GTA became synonymous with a PS2 and everyone involved ended up making a lot of money. Although this is not a mistake, Microsoft made a game. Because at E3 2006, Peter Moore came out on the Xbox stage with a GTA 4 tattoo to show that the upcoming Rockstar mega hit was definitely coming to Xbox 360 this time around. Although Peter Moore also had a Halo 2 release date tattooed on his other arm, so maybe he was either super forgetful or just had a thing for gaming tattoos.
No!
1983 was not a great year for Atari. Its long-running 2600 console was showing its age by this point, and their new 5200 system had failed to impress almost anyone into buying it. Although a large part of the 5200's failure could arguably be put down to 1983 also being the start of the North American video game crash. And the crash really was localised to North America, because in Europe, and especially in Japan, video games were selling like hotcakes still. In fact, 1983 was about the time Nintendo was gearing up to release the Famicom, their first cartridge-based home console. However, while Nintendo were hammering out all the details for the Japanese launch, Hiroshi Yamauchi, the big boss of Nintendo, instructed his American counterpart, Howard Lincoln, to see if Atari would partner with them to launch the Famicom in the US. Atari initially liked the idea because the hottest game at the time was Donkey Kong, and they would be able to sell a system with probably the best version of it. But when Atari saw Coleco demonstrated their new machine at a trade show running an illegal version of Donkey Kong, Atari got angry and went cold on the deal. Nintendo walked away and decided to launch the machine by themselves without an American partner. Now, Atari basically turned down the chance to launch the NES in America with an Atari badge on the front, and obviously was an idiotic decision in hindsight. Although, given them the benefit of the doubt, Nintendo was still a newcomer to the home market at the time, so you could see why it might play out the way it did. What is really stupid, however, is this happened again in 1989, though this time with Sega. Although Sega had mild success in Japan with its Mark III, and great success in Europe with its Master System, America didn't take to the console at all. So, when they wanted to release the Mega Drive, they went to Atari and asked them if they wanted to be a launch partner and do pretty much what Nintendo had asked them to do with the Famicom. Now, any company with any business sense would have looked at Sega's presence in Europe and Japan and remembered the missed Nintendo opportunity, and snapped this offer right up. But, oh no, not Atari. They told Sega that the deal was too expensive and walked away, leaving Sega to launch the incredibly successful Genesis all by themselves. And it's this type of genius business acumen that bankrupted Atari a few years later.
No!
Of course, Sega was going to be on this list more than once. This entire video could have been about mistakes Sega have made, but then it would have been about 3 hours long. But this time, let's talk about one of the ways Sega managed to completely tank the Dreamcast. Now, lots of people will just point to the PlayStation 2 as a reason the Dreamcast failed and call it a day. However, it's not quite as simple as that. Sure, Sony's console was always going to be an issue, but sales of the Dreamcast were actually considerably strong, and the PS2 had a very rocky first year. What with supply problems, lots of faulty units and lack of killer titles, Sega had none of these issues. They were able to supply the large demand for consoles, no hardware issues to speak of, and the range of games was universally praised. The problem was, sales fell off a cliff because piracy became rampant on the machine. Unlike the PlayStation 1 or even the N64, you didn't need any special hardware or modification to run copied games, because Sega had royally messed up. Now, considering it took 20 years for people to work out how to beat the copy protection in Sega's previous machine, the Sega Saturn, it's frankly unbelievable that it took such a short time to break the Dreamcast. And it only happened because of one of Sega's ridiculous ideas and creating something totally unnecessary. At the same time as creating the Dreamcast, Sega also invented a new CD format called MIL-CD. It stood for Music Interactive Live CD. The idea was that these special audio CDs would have extras like video, interactive menus, and online functionality, as well as the music on. The Dreamcast would be able to play these CDs, and Sega hoped this would be a selling point for the system. But MIL-CDs never took off, and only a handful were ever made. The problem was that when the Dreamcast checked to see if a game was inserted, it would run its copy protection but wouldn't start the game if it thought it wasn't legit. But the same copy protection didn't kick in if it thought a MIL-CD was inserted. So hackers just copied Dreamcast games onto CDRs and made sure they're in the MIL-CD format to bypass the protection. Sega's much needed profits from game sales just evaporated, so they had to quickly pivot into being a third-party games company. All in all, this is just textbook Sega. Instead of just putting all their efforts into a really good main product, they had to spoil it by making completely worthless, obsolete within seconds add-ons that no one wants. In Japan, the PC Engine was a massive hit. Designed by Hudson Soft and manufactured by NEC in 1987, it went up against Nintendo's Famicom and managed to gain a decent market share. It had popular games from the likes of Namco, Konami and many others, and is still held in high regard to this day. However, things weren't quite as rosy when it came to the 1989 American launch. Many of the games that were super popular in Japan didn't achieve anywhere near the same level of success in the States. And on top of that, they were not only up against Nintendo's 8-bit juggernaut, but also Sega's newly released 16-bit Genesis. Even changing the console's name to the TurboGrafx 16 didn't seem to help much with a US launch or at any point in its life stateside, and it never found anything near the success it had achieved in Japan. You could argue that the TurboGrafx never really had a huge, must-own exclusive game. But according to Steve Garwood, the sales director of TTI, the company NEC and Hudson jointly formed to manage the TurboGrafx, TTI were offered Mortal Kombat as an exclusive game, but someone in the Japanese branch turned down the offer, saying, "We think Americans are bored of fighting games now." So either TTI didn't want to say that they didn't want to stump up the cash to pay for the exclusivity, or that someone really was bone-headed enough not to see what a huge phenomena that Mortal Kombat actually was. This was the era of complete Street Fighter II dominance, and despite the many attempts from rival studios to pick up some market share, no one came close. No one until Mortal Kombat came along. TTI spent a ton of money on a totally underwhelming CD add-on which no one wanted, so it is quite easy to think that someone really was stupid enough to turn down one of the biggest games of the 90s. Hello you. Thanks ever so much for watching. Please subscribe to be first to see future videos of mine, and if you really want to help me, please consider supporting me on Patreon. But until next time, I'm missing you already.